Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 331. Today, joining me on the podcast, a very exciting episode, JB Morin. How are you?
Hi, Ben. I'm great. I'm great. Thank you for having me again.
It's been far too long. I was looking then and checking when the last time you were on the podcast was. I cannot believe it's essentially 5 years. That's mental.
Yeah, time flies. It was like 2 World Cups ago.
Literally. Yeah, literally. So is everything good with you?
Yeah. All good here. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I'm sure majority of listeners have come across your work. They probably know a lot of the work that you do and have done. But can you start us off? Can you give us a little bit of background on yourself, but also take us into current day in terms of what your day-to-day looks like?
Yeah, sure. So my current main job is a professor at the university. So I'm the director of the sports science department here in Saint Etienne, and I'm a researcher as well. So that's my full-time job, and I'm also directing research. And I have a part-time job aside that's a consultant. So teacher, CPD teacher, and speed consultant with some clubs, including in football. And I'm also now back to a bit of coaching on some very specific missions with some athletes, because my background in sports was playing football first and then being a track and field athlete and a coach. And so I'm super happy that now part of applying our research is going to the clubs and going to see the athletes directly to apply what's in the papers, to adapt it at least.
I think you've seen, and you've probably seen this more than me, but a lot of your work filtering into the preparation that clubs are doing now. It must be, you must have seen that a lot in terms of we obviously get more insight now, don't we, to see what players and teams are doing on social media and all the rest of it. But do you see a lot of your work being put out onto the training pitch?
Yeah, sure. Not only in football, in many sports where speed is important.
Yeah.
So I see some examples in track and field, obviously, in but also in ice hockey and obviously in football. Very often, I'm asked by staffs or individuals on how to best apply things on very concrete questions, and I'm very happy with that because that's the best way to avoid misinterpretations or wrong application of the works. And so that's something I really like to do and see. Yeah.
Yeah, so those broad questions is where we'll start then, JB.
All
With
right.
looking at we were speaking beforehand and we said about looking at sprint mechanics, which you can go into in a second. But the previous episode, for anyone that hasn't listened, it was episode 86. We spoke a lot about sled work, heavy sleds, the implementation of sleds. Probably at a time then when there was some clubs using it, but maybe not so many as there are now. I think it's fair to say. But I think now it's definitely a case of you're seeing that used a lot, aren't you, in terms of the resisted sprint work, sled work within clubs.
Yeah, sure. I think that the main thing that has changed in the last 5 years, I would say, is that um, now people understand that there are, I would say, 50 shades of resisted sprinting. Like now,
Love that.
you still see papers where I think colleagues, academics have not understood, because when you say resisted sprinting, it means nothing.
Hmm.
It's like saying resistance training. Resistance training means nothing. What
Yeah.
load, what scheme, what modality, and so on. So I think that today the most advanced people in the field understand that there are many types of resisted work. Load is different, the stimulus is different, and if you want to be accurate with your athletes, resisted sprinting is a tool to answer your training questions. It is not the training response. And I think that most people now understand that. And for example, a light sled is absolutely not the same as a heavy sled. Both are resisted sprinting, but both are totally different stimuli. It's like an air squat with bands on your knees versus a 3RM deep squat. It's totally different. So now I think that the granularity, um, you know, many more people connect to that, because also studies have shown that they were mechanically very different. The training result was very different. Some beautiful work showing training effect specificity around the loads. So I'm very happy that the field of SNC, including in football, at least for the most up-to-date people, is treating resisted sprinting the way we treat resistance training. So this is great because there has been some kind of a stepping things up there.
Because you said about your work consulting with clubs, has there been any consistency in terms of those performance questions like you just mentioned? Is there anything that's like commonly asked?
Yeah, I think the most, well, first there is a bias there because I think that the clubs who really ask for external consultancy and help in that are already prone to implement that correctly, or they do their work so well that they don't need anyone, and they do it very well on their own, which I see sometimes. But the question is not whether this should be implemented. The question is practically, how can we do that? How can we do that in our context? How can we do that with 2 games a week? How can we do that with a very dense part of the season and nothing else for 6 months in US football, for example? And in soccer, football as we know it, how can you do that in season? What type of microdosing can we do? So that's plenty of practical questions, because I think that the clear research results, systematic reviews show that it's no more a question about is it useful or not for sprint acceleration performance. The question is about how to best implement it and what are the big mistakes to avoid in implementing science.
I think that's the case with everything we see in terms of all research that comes out, isn't it? And you just mentioned there, one of the things I was going to bring up is fixtures, which we speak about a lot. And this, it seems like with the tournaments now, the structure of certain tournaments, essentially practitioners aren't getting too much time available away from games, are they? Like, especially within Europe, we're having games that we've got multiple game weeks. We've got, I mean, towards certain periods, the congestion of fixtures is pretty tight. So what is your general sort of advice for coaches to get this work into their players within those challenges in place?
Yeah, so it's very fun because the 2 last pro clubs I thought about that that was my first question. My first question was, how much time can you spend developing or maintaining the player's sprint acceleration power?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you say we want to develop / maintain that, but we have no time, I will answer, I have no magic stick. And second, honestly, if you want, maybe there's a way that you will find time.
Yeah.
If the fixture is so heavy that you can do nothing except recovery from a previous game and quick prep for the coming game, then there's no way you can develop anything. And there might be a way to maintain by microdosing things and using a resisted sprint rep like any other type of conditioning rep. But at some point, it's like a paradox to me to say we want to push things, develop, but we have no time. Then don't bother. There's no way you will develop. But find development windows in your entire season, and then think about trying to maintain by regularly as possible, stimulating the system. I definitely think that even 2 or 3 reps of 10 meters with a substantial amount of load can be a good enough stimulus to maintain things. No way you can develop, but at least to maintain things in season.
So a better question for yourself would be, JB, I've got 2 15-minute periods within my week. I've got these amount of players that are hopefully going to be fit and be able to take part in the session. How can we utilize that time? That's probably a better question, isn't it, for you to then tackle?
Yeah, no. I love these kind of challenges because that's real life challenges. If I say, look, there's no way we can do anything and you should stick to our research protocol, nobody will ever be able to use that correctly, especially in Europe in football.
Mm.
So if we have 2 times 15 minutes, there will be at some point, I will need some data for each player. That's going to take 3 sprints, one unloaded, two loaded ones, just to give me an idea of what they need, what are their mechanics, and better adapt their training load. If I can do that, then 15 minutes twice a week is a good amount. It's the minimum amount of time to get some stimulus, like a little 10 sprints per week or something. Then the point is, if I don't have time to assess the players and I go, by guessing, I will tend to use a general approach with the same load for all the guys. But this type of approach does make sense because it's like you tell me, let's do some high intensity runs to develop their whatever you want, and let's all run at the same running speed. That is stupid.
Mm.
Well, training with the same load is also stupid. So for the same reasons, I need some data to at least bucket the players to avoid some big mistakes. In any type of stimulus, I will need that as well. So, and then 2 times 15 minutes, you know, I am not sure it's going to develop anything in pro football, but I think that might be enough to limit some decreases for example, power output, which has been shown in pro players throughout the season. So that might be a good way. And I will try to negotiate 2 times 30 minutes, to be honest.
Well,
But
I was just
yeah,
going to say that. So when we get to that point of a window of opportunity, whether it be, say, an international break or end of season or whatever it's going to be, what would be your advice then for clubs, coaches, players in terms of structuring that time to get the most out of it in terms of that power development?
yeah. So here, that's going to be very interesting because if I have time to program anything I want, I would go with 3 very little sessions of 30 minutes per week. And this is what I am thinking about now with a pro club. One is oriented towards maximum acceleration slash force. So that's going to be heavy resisted sprinting and projection. The second one will be oriented towards high speed. Okay. And the last one will be, so these 2 sessions will be around, let's call that kinetics, like producing force at low and high speed. And the last session will be around kinematics, around sprint posture, sprint pattern, the quality of the foot ankle, the stiffness of the body on the ground, trying to be efficient in limiting the energy leaks all over the place. And this one might also connect to injury risk prevention. So 3 times 30, and 30 minutes means they are warmed up correctly. There is no, we should leave before because the coach is waiting. There is no, you see what I mean? So
30
we
minutes
will
of
have
work.
30 minutes. Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Because
30.
sometimes,
Yeah,
you come
that
in late, you leave earlier, and then you say, okay, we worked for 7 minutes and a half.
which
And
again can easily be real life in football,
oh,
can't it?
yes. Oh, yes.
So JB, on that structure then with those 3 sessions, the kinematic session, the last of the three that you mentioned, is that the session you'd maybe be looking at more change direction work and adding multi-plane work in as well?
Yeah, that could be the case. The objective of this session is 30, 45 minutes. It shouldn't be taxing mechanically and physically speaking. So that's going to be all very intense actions, but very short actions. Bounding, there might be some changes of direction. Um, there will be some changes of orientation for the trunk, for example, in the sorry, in the exercises.
Mm.
And that's going to be multi-directional and around having the guys better at bouncing on the ground, at reorienting the ground reaction force with effectiveness, avoiding, the body vertical collapse when they are running or moving super fast, and being better at resisting perturbations, which is very, very important in football, as you know.
100%. No, that's really interesting and gives really nice structure. I think to obviously there's a lot more context to apply onto that, isn't there? But it's a nice structure for people to work off within those opportunities. I think the other side of it is that kind of what we were referencing before, those 2 15 minutes could probably easily be made into 2 30 minutes if we really wanted it to be within a season. So it's just finding that time, isn't it? And prioritizing.
Yes, yes, sure. I played football myself and I know the football context, but honestly, in some clubs, uh, the players are at the club 3 to 4 hours a day, which is plenty of opportunity for 1 or 2 more hours at the club and let's work. I've been a competitor in endurance sports such as road cycling and triathlon. I mean, 30 minutes, it's when there's a will, there's a way, and it's not going to change the entire week of football. To me, that's an excuse for not doing it more than a real physiological, biomechanical argument.
Yeah, 100%. Just before we move on to the sprint mechanics, what key lessons can we take from your experiences in some of the other sports that you worked in, JB?
Wow, that is very interesting. I think there's two key points. One key point is about programming the physical work because in some sports it's maybe a bit better done than in football with a more integrative approach where everyone is sitting around the table and the technical coaches will discuss and negotiate with the physical staff about what they do. I know this occurs in some clubs, but in some other clubs, people work in silos and they don't care about the 30 minutes with the other guys. They care about their own 1 hour or 2 hours.
Yeah.
So I think, yes, better discussing between different staffs for sure. And the second thing is to maybe better consider the individual load, the individual players' loads, because some players in a very congested fixture still have some time to work that other players don't. So there should be a big difference between, the regular starters versus the finishers, to not say the substitutes. And better imagine that, okay, on the team, this guy for next week has some working opportunities because of, you name it, and a bit more individualizing things. Yeah.
That's interesting. Very interesting. So when we look over on for the sprint mechanics side of things, we spoke about like performance questions before and maybe how impactful we can be with a squad. When we're looking at sprint mechanics, where would your focus lie?
So first, in the 2 or 3 studies so far published, where we very specifically focused on some points in the sprint mechanical pattern, we have seen some changes in performance. So it means that, okay, that was not elite football players, end of career people, and so on, but it means that the way people move is very likely a part of their final performance. So I'm not mentioning here injury prevention because the way they move is also related to the constraint, the strain in their muscles and tendons. But the way they move can allow for more performance. I'm going to give you 2 examples. One is the foot ankle behavior at high speed or during changes of direction. We know now, and there's going to be a second study published with my team here, that the force output at the foot and ankle is related to some dynamic movements performance, like horizontal broad jump, change of direction, and so on. So a weaker athlete on that side will very likely be a less performing athlete. That's going to be one part of their chain, not the only one, of course, but that's going to be a part of the chain. And so working on that strength, that stiffness, that ability to react will very likely transfer to some sports movements. I know that we don't test on the pitch. I need to defend very quickly types of movements. We need to standardize things. But honestly, if my COD impulse improves and if my broad jump improves on a laboratory test, I will not be the same player on a pitch. That's for sure. I don't see why these improvements would not transfer, at least in part, to some better movement on the pitch.
So that's some advice for coaches to be prioritizing straight away with players.
Yeah, and the other thing is there's been a very cool series of systematic reviews by Ben Nicholson from UK, showing that just playing football, which is the case of most control groups in this kind of studies, just playing football changes nothing, except if you're a beginner and you've never played football, you're going to move faster after 1 or 2 seasons. But if you're trained, just playing football will not be a good enough stimulus to develop these physical capabilities. So that's something you need to solve with other type of interventions.
Yeah, 100%, which makes sense, and that shows the value in the work that we're doing, and also it sort of justifies what we said about before about finding the time to get that work in as well, doesn't it? I know we were talking about resisted sprints before, but for any sort of work, this is the justification, isn't it?
Yeah, this is why I tend to not dislike, but I'm a bit frustrated with the SNC, strength and conditioning word, because it's too reductionist. I prefer, and we call that in France, physical preparation, préparation physique in French. And to me, physical preparation is much more than SNC or a bit different. And it means I'm going to prepare you physically for what? For the demands of your sport. And so that's very interesting, because otherwise it would be sport preparation or sports training. It's physical preparation. So I'm a big fan of considering physical prep as I'm going to prepare your body, your physique, for high intensity football plays and so on.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that is the case now, especially with job titles. That's coming into play a little bit more within the UK as well, because it's a more full-rounded approach, isn't it, to what we do? Not strength conditioning. It's actually, there's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah, and the thing is very interesting is that there is like not a drift, but there is a trend in jobs where it's either super macroscopic, like head of performance, performance director, which means, supervising everything.
Yeah.
Or super narrow, like strength specialist or SNC specialists or mobility and so on. In big staffs in the US systems, you have people in charge of players' health and mobility, for example. So, and to me, physical preparation is somewhere in between, and it's very specific. Like it's everything that's not directly football to become a better football player or to remain a high-level football player.
Yeah, that's a really interesting debate. I think we could probably do a whole different podcast on that as well with the future in terms of roles, like how specific roles are, like whether we want them to be specific, whether we want them to be more general. I think is an interesting debate as well, isn't it? But you're right, like this is what we're seeing within current day, isn't it? We're seeing these different approaches by clubs. Obviously, it's driven by budget and driven by a lot of other things, but it's definitely the case at the minute, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's important, I teach to BSc and MSc students here at the faculty, and I try to tell them that they need to be okay with all the dimensions of physical preparation. So if they tell me, I'm a strength specialist, I'm going to say, look, a body is not only strength. So read a bit about endurance, read a bit about, the energetic systems and so on, because that's going to be a very limiting factor, because, many clubs cannot afford a specialist for every dimension of the physical prep. So you need to be at least aware and a bit competent in many sides of the physical prep. Yeah.
Well, the funny part of that, I suppose, is that like when you spoke about like siloed working before, does that mean that we work on strength, but as soon as we cross into anything that's speed based, you have to pass it on to the next person. Like it doesn't really work like that, does it, when you're working with a player?
Yeah. I've seen that. I've seen
Yeah,
that. And it's not systematic, it's not everywhere. We don't want to,
yeah,
stereotype things. But I've seen that a lot. Like, okay, it's about speed and sprinting, not my business. Well, at least not my area of competency. We need a speed specialist. Okay,
yeah,
but the speed specialist to make people faster needs to be also a strength specialist because you will need strength at some point. So, you see what I mean? So at some point, when you hyper specialize, there is a saying in French that says you become more and more specialized into less and less things. And if you push that reasoning forward, you're going to be the best specialist in the world about nothing because you're going to push about that. So you want to remain a generalist.
yeah, definitely. And what I would say from a lot of titles that I'm aware of is that when clubs have bigger staffs, it still doesn't represent such a niche area. Like a lot of staff cross over with what they're doing, don't they? Across a different.
Yeah.
It's just a title in some clubs.
Yeah.
But no, really interesting debate. JB, can we move on to gait retraining? So when we were talking about topics before, we were speaking about retraining gait with players. I think it's a really interesting topic. Where would you direct people's attention and sort of put your focus on when we're looking at retraining a player's gait?
Yeah. So first, the word gait retraining to me is a bit confusing because it's very likely coming from rehab-oriented studies where it implies that there is something to fix. And I prefer the word gait or kinematics training just to say we're going to try and move with a more efficient way. First of all, for performance, regardless of injury or rehabilitation. So, yeah, training the sprint pattern. Um, there's going to be some big rocks there. The trunk position, the managing the trunk movements, especially at high speed, high intensity with changes of direction. Uh, Jonas Dodu, I think, calls that trunk discipline. I love the approach. Then, of course, pelvis discipline and the quality of leg and foot and ankle movement. That means how they react to the ground, how fast are you able to apply high amounts of force, because you might be able to apply high amounts of force in the gym, but when your body has 0.15 or zero point 0.2 seconds to apply force, you apply much less. So that's the main part of the gait training.
No, that's interesting as well, isn't it? That transfer and how we work on that transfer, which kind of ties in with what we are just talking about with the
Yeah,
understanding of both areas as well, isn't it? Relating it over onto the pitch.
yeah. I give you a very simple example here about trunk discipline. When you're on the pitch, you're always moving around. You always have some, opponents pushing you. You always try to resist or try to push someone. And so there's a lot of forces around the upper body that you have to either generate or resist to. If your core muscles, I mean, every trunk muscle that is responsible for part of these trunk movements towards someone or towards yourself is weak and not reactive enough, then all of your movements of that type will be less efficient. So we are going to try and stimulate that reactivity, quickness, high degree of rate of force application in these muscles. And so, for example, I love working with heavy kettlebells because when you manipulate heavy kettlebells with your arms around your trunk, you generate these kind of forces because the main forces are attached to your shoulders. And so when you just switch from one hand to the other with a very heavy kettlebell, like, heavy ones, 1/3 of body mass, 1/4 of body mass minimum, then switching hands will, in a few milliseconds, bam, shift your trunk on the side. And the question is, can you resist that or not? And I have seen some people, for example, in American football, in rugby, with very high strength qualities for the trunk, for the lower limb, and so on, beasts and in this context, of a very high slash super fast force production, they were a bit confused. They were a bit lost because they didn't have that trunk perturbation management. So that's the kind of work we can do.
And I suppose with that as well, when you're talking about increasing movement efficiency and taking that onto the pitch, that's all with that improvement of the work that you're relating to there, that is also going to hopefully reduce risk of certain injuries as well.
Yeah, so first, movement efficiency, you will find many people criticizing that. I prefer talking about energy transmission or force transmission to the ground and to the body back, because basically when you push on the ground reaction force will move your body forward, and an efficient transmission will very be, what we are talking about here. In terms of injuries, there is nothing very clear in the literature because it's very difficult to define what is a more efficient movement. When we both move, who is the most efficient? We don't know how to define it. But I prefer what we did with Chris Brahma and Jordan Mendiguccia. I prefer to think about the mechanical strain in the muscles. If my movement, because of the lever arms, because of the masses, because of things we can quantify, of the angles, the range of motion, if my movement generates more strain in the muscle tendons, then yes, all things equal, we can hypothesize that there will be a higher risk of injuries. So to give you an example here, if I sprint or I move very often with a lot of trunk incline, mathematically, I'm putting more tension in my posterior chain, glutes, hamstrings. So very likely, my posterior chain plays with a higher mechanical strain and so a higher risk of injury. And so in some cohort studies, very difficult studies to run, people have observed a link between injuries in pitchers, in runners, in football players, and trunk incline. So it makes sense from a functional anatomy perspective. Some very difficult studies have seen some, emerging results, and this is how we deal with movement and injury risk. But you will always find people saying there is no clear relationship in the literature. And I will answer, hey guys, you know how hard it is to do? And on the other side, there is no clear proof of the opposite. So there is no clear proof that movement efficiency is not related to the risk. There is just no proof of anything. So we don't know. And so we stick to what makes sense biomechanically speaking.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's also interesting that there's not a blueprint way of moving, is there? Like we're looking, you're constantly talking about improving where we are at currently, rather than getting to this certain destination where we want to be.
You will find some players with 20 years of high-level football, with anteriorly tilted pelvis, with a crazy forward lean trunk, and zero hamstring injuries. It's just because it's not that simple. It's a puzzle. And so maybe they are super strong. Maybe they were protected in terms of sprint exposure. That was perfectly well regulated. Maybe they are super lucky that their muscle coordination and their muscle tissue and tendon tissue is resistant enough and they never get injured. But as for any kind of statistics, there are some, exceptions, and there are some trends, and the trends start to emerge now with this type of behavior.
How much does position and I suppose type of player impacts the work that you're doing when you're looking at this efficiency and improving from where we're at currently? How much you take into account the type of player? So if it's a fullback or a wing back, for example, if they are very aggressively getting up and down, doing a lot of lifting, does that impact your work?
Yeah. So it does not impact it in terms of interpreting their raw mechanics, like the way they run. But it will indirectly, to me, impact their strain because of the exposure to sprinting. So there's 2 points here. Either the player has a position and a style of play, because sometimes the same player at the same position and the coach changes, and they will have a totally different menu to deal with. So it's not only the position, but if the position and the context, the style of play requires a lot of aggressive acceleration or a lot of top speed, I will think about it in a way that the kinematics will be a bit more important if the player has many movements on the pitch. And we should see it this way, because some players will be underexposed, some player will be overexposed, and we have also to deal with the sprint exposure in addition to the kinematics.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because that can also be impacted by performances of a team as well, couldn't it? Style of players of a team,
Yeah, sure.
form of a team sometimes as well, because you might be doing a bit more chasing and not have as much of the ball. There's a lot that goes into that, isn't there?
Yeah. So I'll give you an example. You see a team collectively, they spend an entire game with almost no one running any distance above 90% of their top speed. So it was like a no sprint game.
Yeah.
Then you have two options. Either you say, look, you see, they don't sprint during games. So why should we bother preparing for that? Or you see, look, they haven't sprint during that game. So there is a stimulus that is missing. We need to compensate for that. You see, there's two orientations. And this is something I hear very often in football. To me, the problem of the first approach is that, okay, but this is that game, these conditions, this opponent. Now, if in 2 games from now, you have a crazy offensive, defensive team, and there's going to be, hundreds of meters collectively above this super high-speed threshold, are you prepared for that? No, that's going to be an issue. That's going to be an issue.
Yeah. And I think we see that. I think we see that with new coaches coming in trying to input a style of play as well, don't we? Where you've seen it before, where coaches come in, they change the style of play, and then suddenly players are struggling.
Yeah, there's like a culture shock.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the shock is the other way around. The shock is a very defensive coach, like the style of play will involve less speed, much more of many things different, but less speed overall, or less speed but more volume, for example. But sometimes the shock is in the other direction. We go from good volume, very low speed stimulus to a new coach that is having all the players sprint. And then either they are ready for that, or you see first good performance and then very high number of muscle injuries. To me, it's logical. You cannot, that's the problem. You cannot change the tissue adaptation, the movement in a couple of weekends,
No.
So we come back to physical preparation. You play football, you want to be physically ready for anything coach related, season results related, opponents related, that's going to come at you.
I think that's the real skill of a physical coach in that scenario, isn't it? To say, all right, the style of play is changing or whatever we're doing up here, but I know that I've got to get this work into players to maintain make sure they're ready and they're available.
And if you think about the players individually, if they are physically prepped and they are physically ready to anything or almost anything, they can be much more valuable on the market. They can be much more adaptable to new coaches or, safe in a new environment. And again, much more physically ready. Because if you're only physically ready for one type of football with one coach, then any change will be a challenge.
Yeah. Definitely. No, it's great advice as well, because that's some real life scenarios that coaches will find themselves in with change of management
Yeah.
or change of form or change of styles that
Yeah.
coaches might put in.
I'll give you a very simple example here. That's very, very often in France in the last 10 years. When people change, the club changes the main training pitches to some turfs,
Mm.
okay, which is a huge change mechanically speaking. In some clubs, for the players, the young players especially, the transition is smooth. There is no specific, medical issue. They adapt. In some other clubs, there are a lot of injuries at the triceps and so on. In my opinion, it's not bad luck. It's just that in some clubs, the players were prepared for that. They were ready. They had enough, adaptation possibilities to cope for this change in surface, either because it was anticipated, because it doesn't change from one day to the other. So they anticipated that and reinforced the triceps, the foot and ankle, and so on. Or the players had a very good level of fitness overall, which made them okay to adapt to this new turf, even progressively.
Well, that's another interesting factor, isn't it? That
Yeah.
I,
And as I very often say, when you say it's a plague, it's the same for everyone. No, 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 no. In some clubs, there are some very good results about injuries. There are some very good results about players' availability and fitness. And honestly, we need to acknowledge that.
yeah, definitely. JB, can we talk about any work that you've got in sort of in the pipeline coming up that you and your team are doing?
Yeah, cool. So there's three main works coming up. One is around foot and ankle strengthening by a physiotherapist working on that. He's going to present his PhD thesis. His name is Romain Tourillon. We did an intervention study in high-level athletes of different sports, including football, where we strengthened the foot and ankle, and we saw some gains in strength, muscle volume, and performance in jump, COD, and so on. So very cool. The second one is about resisted sprinting. We're still doing some work on that. And we have a very cool study where we compared the running mechanics under resistance or without resistance. And we did that at the same running speed. Because most of the studies that say, look, when you pull resistances, your mechanics change, so you shouldn't do it,
Mhm.
they have a bias. It's
Mhm.
because they compare the mechanics at different speeds. Because obviously, when you pull a load, you're running slower.
Mhm.
So we said, okay, we are going to compare, apples and apples. We're going to compare what's comparable. And the main result of the study is that overall, among the many, many, many mechanical variables that we've assessed, running is very, very similar between the two conditions if you compare at the same speed. So I would say that resisted sprinting has an effect on running mechanics, but it's because it has an effect on running speed. But you don't run differently at the same speed with or without resistance, which is a cool info. And the last project is about field assessment of kinematics. I think this is very important because it's very heavy to do a lab-based 3D motion capture kinematic assessment. And we are going to have a project around assessing that with a high-speed 2D cameras like iPhones or iPads. It's going to be partly based around the S-Mass score of Chris Brahma. So Chris is collaborating with us on that. And we are going to try to first validate this simple field 2D approach compared to laboratory 3D motion capture reference. And then we're going to go to clubs, football, rugby, to assess the kinematics a bit more regularly. Think about, is it related to previous or coming hamstring injuries, all this kind of stuff. And can we try and correct things when we see red flags? That's the three main topics right now.
So a lot of work that could
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
be
I'm ve-
impacting some practitioners in football as well.
yeah, yeah, sure, yeah, sure. I'm very happy that first we have very good equipment and research possibilities at my lab, and very good students as well. So some of them are both physiotherapists and master students. So they kind of know the field practice. So this is very cool.
I think the foot strengthening research you mentioned is really interesting. Was that some of the work that you posted on your Instagram recently, the barefoot
Yeah,
sort
yeah.
of, yeah,
Yeah, so I've always been a fan of this kind of work, and since I was a track and field coach like 25 years ago, and
yeah,
it always made sense to me. And I'm very happy that we could have this PhD project with Romain Tourillon because he was able to bring some, rationale, some overload exercises to to implement. And so when I coach now or when I do workshops, we do a lot of foot strengthening. And the main point is that there were some studies around foot strengthening in the past. We did not invent that, but they were mainly based on body weight slash foot yoga, posture, and elastic bands. And we brought a real overload strengthening with heavy weights and everything, so that after a foot training session of 40 minutes, you have DOMS. You know what that means? It
yeah.
means, yes, we overloaded the system, which was not the case in most of previous studies.
Hmm. No, that's really interesting. JB, where would you like to see, especially with football, I'm relating more to football now, where would you like to see more research done around sort of speed, sprint work? Is there anything for listeners maybe that are looking to do research? Where would you like to see more research done?
That's interesting. I think I would like to see more research done on the effect of training interventions that are multimodal and that include both the motor and the transmission, which is both force and power output, but also force transmission to the ground and all these kind of satellite work for many, which are to me central works. Because if you're a monster in producing force, but you're a teddy bear in transmitting that force, the ground is going to give back, you're not efficient. So I think we should balance things a bit more.
I love that. Monster and a teddy bear. Love
Yeah, sure. You know,
it.
sure.
Yeah, brilliant. JB, that's been brilliant. I really appreciate you giving up the time coming back on. It's been far too long, and it's great to see the work that you continue to do,
Cool,
and
thanks.
being so well received in football as well. So thank you very much for everything that you do. Um, will you give the listeners, if they want to keep up with the work that you're doing, where would you direct them?
Very easy. That's going to be my LinkedIn and Instagram. I'm less and less on X. I know that people follow what we publish on X, so I keep on publishing, but I've seen so many crap things that I'm not following X anymore, not only because of the owner. But yeah, LinkedIn, Instagram, and my website if people want to contact me or see the podcasts such as this one. My website is jbmorin.net. So feel free to go there and contact.
Amazing. JB, thank you very much for coming on.
Cool. Cheers. Bye bye.